But Danielle, you're going to be talking about representational power and responsibility, which I think are some of the most important issues around. So I'm going to hand over to you and let you begin if you want to share your screen.
All right. Well, thank you, David and Savannah and Aline for having me into the Seven Foundation. I'm super excited and grateful to be here with all of you and can't wait for your questions. It's my favorite part of presentations. Let me just put my presentation in. As David mentioned, I'm a photojournalist, independent photojournalist, based in my hometown of Houston, Texas. And this presentation is, I'm going to give you all a little bit of, this is about ethics. So I'll probably share, information that I wouldn't normally in a presentation. Normally I'm focusing mostly on the stories of the people I photographed and, the situations that they are in. But I'll, sprinkle that with a little bit of, about myself and my own career. So for example, I've been doing this professionally since 2014, but really started photography in high school, which has been more than half my life now. So just to give you all a little bit of context in terms of my sort of career and path. So I'm sure many of the previous photographers have, oh look, I did a misspelling there, have touched on this, but I think this is important for me to start off with this slide to talk a little bit about what ethics means to me before we dive into my long-term project that will highlight a lot of these points that I'd like to make about ethics. So for me, ethics is number one. That is the most important thing ever in your life. In photography, it's more important than a picture. Ethics is number one. Without sound, solid ethics, to me, I feel like you may be able to create beautiful work, but the sort of backbone that work is founded on is not there. So ethics is not only about like just having honest relationships with people, which is really important, but it's also about creating work that withstands time. So yeah, to me, ethics is more important than any picture. People's stories are sacred. The people that we photograph are sacred. The fact that they let us into their lives and share some of their, most intimate details of their lives with us is absolutely sacred. So we should treat those stories and the people that we photograph as such, which means taking care of that information that they provide to us, taking care of the people that we photograph, and like through our work. Informed consent to me is paramount. So that means, as I'm sure y'all have already gone over in this series, but informed consent means, clearly communicating your intention, where the work might end up, in terms that people understand, right? You have to take every person in every situation as different, right? It's not like a cookie cutter across the board formula for talking about consent, and really taking the time to have those conversations when you can. Ethics to me is founded on transparency, trust, communication, and honesty. So when you can, work slow or with the similar principles of working slow, which basically means just stop and talk to people. Even in fast news situations. As David mentioned, I covered Title 42 along the border with Texas and Mexico, very fast-paced situation, but still tried probably 99% of the time and was able to actually stop and talk to people, before photographing, or maybe taking pictures at first and then having a conversation with people. And not that like getting stories from people is the point. Again, just being able to get their consent is really important, and be able to explain who you are and what you're doing with their stories, and the intention is there. But obviously talking to people is, so important for what we do as journalists. That's how we know what they're going through. That's how we learn about them and their stories. And sometimes when you talk to people, maybe you come across like a different story or a different angle to the story that you're working on. Because oftentimes as journalists, we might go into a situation thinking that the story is one way, but it's so important to talk to people to make sure that that actually is the story, that we're not just inventing stories. So talk to people. It's so important. Talk to people. And then thinking about ethics and how it goes beyond relationship building, how it goes beyond just, talking about consent, talking about your intentions, but translating into the types of images you make, creating ethical imagery. And we'll go into that in the presentation. And then how can ethics even go beyond the photographed image into who you are as a photographer, the impact you make as a photographer through your work for the communities that you photograph, or to chip away at some of the issues that you're covering, or even within the visual media industry. And of course, there are some hard and fast rules about ethics, which again, I'm sure y'all have gone over, but there are also many gray areas. At the end of the day, we're people, these are situations, context change. So never be afraid to ask. Ask your peers, ask editors, ask, people who have been in this industry longer than you have. Nobody can fault you for not knowing. I mean, ethics can be complicated. It can be nuanced. So have these conversations. Don't be shy to have these conversations. Ask these questions and inform yourself, which you are all doing. So that's great. And then to get a little bit more deep into the topic within ethics of representational power and responsibility. So as journalists, our responsibility actually is to tell the whole story, to represent the whole story, not just a part of the story, but the entire story as best we can. Obviously, I know sometimes, situations can be really fast-paced, but again, how can we use those principles of working slowly in fast-paced environments? For me, that means trying to avoid sensationalistic, stereotypical imagery or romanticizing an issue. We are journalists, so our job is to ethically tell the story. Again, touching on, a lot of what we already said: informed consent, communicating clearly, honestly with people, really treating people with respect. Acknowledge and understand the power you hold as a journalist. We are in a very powerful position as journalists to be able to share people's stories on these large platforms, even if it's your own social media, where lots of people are going to see your work. And there are power dynamics there, of course, between yourself as a journalist and the people you photograph. So you have to be aware of those, because it does make a difference, especially in terms of, seeking consent from people. You have to understand, that you hold that the power is different, and taking that into consideration with people is really important. For example, never manipulating people to say yes, which means providing all of the information about what your intentions are, where the images might end up. And even sometimes, like, you can pick up on silent cues of discomfort, you know, maybe people are like, okay. And, you know, for me, I'm like, and I'll even say sometimes, hey, a lot of the time actually, hey, it's okay. This is not obligatory. You do not have to do this. You don't have to talk to me. Like, if you don't want to be photographed, or it's okay. And a lot of times people will be like, okay, yeah, I'd rather not. And I'm like, okay, totally cool, not a problem. Allow space and time for people to ask you questions. And people have the right to change their mind. You know, a lot of times, well, not a lot of times actually, but, you know, in some cases, people might say yes at first, and maybe then they change their mind. And that could be the very same moment, it could be the very same day, or it could be years from now. So having that informed continuous consent with people is really important, especially in long-term projects. And then, you know, grappling with these conflicting feelings of being a journalist, the fact that we create images of people in order to try to ethically represent their lives and their stories to raise awareness about a certain issue, and then we get compensated for that to make a living as a journalist. That can feel really confusing and really difficult. And for me, the way that I have sort of dealt with those conflicting feelings is reminding myself that I am a photojournalist. The tool that I have is a camera. And my intention as a photojournalist is to try to raise awareness of these issues in the hopes that people are educated and then use that education to make choices. And so that's sort of how I negotiate those internal conflicts within myself, when I oftentimes feel very powerless as a photographer to actually make, you know, impact in someone's life in a very real way, in a more direct way. Say, for example, you know, just being able to more directly help someone or support someone, you know, is unethical as photojournalist. So I try to remind myself that my tool is a camera. I'm not an activist. I'm not an immigration lawyer. I'm not a doctor. I'm not, you know, I am a photographer, and this is the tool that I chose. And sometimes it may fall short, maybe a lot of times, but the intention is to try to make impact through the work that I'm doing as a photographer. And then often, and I'll talk about this in my presentation, which I'm about to get into, aim for impact through photography and your work as a photographer. So wherever possible, whenever possible, you know, try to think of ways that your photography can go even further beyond just a published image, through, you know, social impact initiatives or collaborating with other people outside of the photography industry, but who are working on the same issue that you are. And my presentation will highlight that point. So without further ado, we will actually look at some pictures now. I just want to give a warning that some of the themes and content I discuss will touch on violence, sexual assault, discrimination. So just want to give a warning about that. So for the past 10 years, I have, well, let me just stop for a second. So I'm going to be showing this long-term project that I think that highlights a lot of these points I want to make around ethics. So for more than 10 years now, I've been photographing communities of trans women throughout Latin America. I started in Argentina, then continued in Peru, and then focused on Central America, Mexico, and now the United States. And this chapter of that work is called A Light Inside, and is photographing communities of trans women in Lima, Peru, where I lived for about 3 years. And I really wanted to show the consequences of the fact that the majority of trans women throughout Latin America are pushed into sex work because of discrimination and transphobia that starts at a very, very young age, that stigmatizes women, marginalizes women, and are thus unable to find further, to find other options for employment or educational opportunities, or even opportunities to protect their health. So I wanted to focus on the consequences of this systemic discrimination, transphobia, against trans women. And at the time, I remember not seeing a lot of pictures in the media that showed a more full story of what trans women in Latin America face. A lot of images were very sort of stereotypical, only focusing on women working in the streets at night, which of course this image here depicts. But I tried to zoom out a little bit to show the context of where they were, to show, people on the streets, not just necessarily hyper focusing on sex work as the topic, but zooming out to photograph, life at home, life with their partners, with family, to show the aftermath of violent moments like this, where Berisa's boyfriend, got really upset with her and was throwing things and punching mirrors, but photographing the aftermath of that, the quietness of that. So trying to tell this part of the story, but in a quieter way. Because again, as journalists, we want to tell the whole story, which in the case of, this community of trans women doesn't mean ignoring the fact that they face a lot of life-threatening situations, but trying to balance that with daily life as well. For example, images like this of Yasuri taking flowers to a Peruvian saint's tomb who she would visit every week, or daily life moments like this, which, for all intents and purposes might be considered sort of, boring moments, right? Hanging out in your room, hanging out outside on the street, but trying to find the beauty of those moments in order to show the tight-knit community, the love between women and their partners or family and friends, this community of friends that a lot of women rely on each other, and just moments that are relatable, right? Giggling in your room with a friend, playing sports, having a hobby that you're really passionate about, celebrating your birthday where your friend throws cake in your face. And I remember showing this work to a very prominent, well-known photographer, and they said, like, why are you showing this side of this? Like, nobody wants to see this. We want to see the more, lack of a better word, they said, like, the sexier images, the images at night, the images of women working in the street, which again, to me as a journalist, our job, our duty is to tell the whole story. Otherwise we run the risk, and oftentimes do, sensationalize communities, sensationalize issues, sensationalize people, and we stereotype them. And if we're stereotyping communities and people, we are not telling the full picture. We're not telling the whole story. And so, again, my job as a journalist, I feel, is to try to tell that whole story, both in this case, the life-threatening situations that women do actually find themselves in, because that is a real part of their story, but also the other side, the daily life moments, the beautiful moments with friends and family that show love and connection and community. Another way
Danielle,
please.
Can I pose a question there that Arturo has posed, because it's about the notion of the whole story, which I think is important to what you were saying there. And he's suggesting that it sounds good to say that one's telling the whole story, but will you ever be able to cover every angle of a story? And isn't it the case that sometimes you want to side with a particular actor or a set of actors in the story? How would you think about that balance? And in that sense, what is the whole story kind of referring to?
Really good questions. So no, I don't think that it's possible to tell the whole story. I mean, in 10 years, I'm trying, I mean, sometimes this is why we pursue long-term work, because assignment work or, being in a community for 2 or 3 days, it's really difficult to try to tell the whole story. That is why I've dedicated myself to this topic and these communities for over 10 years to try to tell a more complete story. But I realize, I mean, this is probably, I mean, who knows? I'm still a little young. I may have another long-term project that I work on for 10 plus years, but I don't, and then it's also required a lot of resources. This work has been, thankfully supported by a lot of grants. So I just also want to take into consideration that even if we want to tell the whole story across many, many years, of course, sometimes the inability to do that because of financial situations can be difficult, right? But long answer short, I think, no, I don't think it's possible for us to tell the whole story, at least not as an individual. Maybe over time, collectively, journalists can try to paint a whole story of a certain community or issue. For me, the whole story means, again, not just focusing on one aspect of the story. And this is my own interpretation of it. That is sometimes the beautiful and frustrating thing about this craft of photography. There's not really a right or wrong, way to do anything. But for me, the whole story means focusing on as many aspects of a person's life as I can. So again, not photographing the fact that a lot of these women, the majority of these women, rely on sex work to survive, but then zooming out of that often very sensationalized, stereotypical portrayal of trans women to show the fuller picture of what that sex work, of what being relegated to sex work poses threats to women, both in terms of their health, safety on the streets, etc. And then even beyond that, to show just a representation of what their lives look outside of that, very central part of their story, unfortunately. And so it means for me, not just focusing on one aspect of someone's story, but zooming out to paint a more full, nuanced picture of someone's life. But then also kind of zooming in, which I'm about to get into on the next slide. And then I think there were 3 parts to that question. I'm going to turn my fan on.
Right.
There was a 3rd part to that question, I think.
That aren't there times that you would like to actually side with a particular person or a particular angle on the story?
Sure. Yeah. And that's also a very good question. And I think there are times when you do. I think our role as journalists is to try to be unbiased as much as we possibly can. But we are also people. For me, as a journalist, striving for being unbiased means showing all of the facts, showing the whole story. Again, this is a long-term project, and you'll see in a few slides the ways that I have tried to use this work for, positive social impact, which, I mean, clearly I have, I think maybe not necessarily in my work, but in what I've done with that work, you can see that I obviously empathize with the people I'm photographing and, want to try to create, at the very least, awareness of this issue, because I am invested in wanting to change the way society in many regions and around the world view trans people. Right. So yes, I definitely clearly have a viewpoint on that. But I think, again, ultimately as journalists, we become biased when we only show one side of the story, right? You go to, I don't know, any community anywhere, and you only focus on one aspect of the story, and you're not zooming out to show the full story, you're being biased, right? So to me, again, it means trying to show different aspects of one story or one person. So, but no, it's very hard. I mean, we're not AI. So we're human too. And we make mistakes and, fall short a lot of the time. So, but on that note, another way that I try to tell the whole story is by also zooming in, and following particular individuals for long periods of time as a way to sort of document the issue or highlight the issue, but through one or a couple of people's lives, right? As opposed to trying to show the whole issue through multiple people, doing a little bit of that, but then also honing in on maybe one or two individuals and highlighting that issue that many, in this case, trans women face, but through the lives of one or two people. So it's sort of telling a portrait of the community or the issue through a couple of people. And so one way I've done that in A Light Inside was photographing Tamara. She was actually the first trans woman I really started to intimately photograph. And by intimate, I mean, photographing her across 3 years often, just going and hanging out. And I want to also mention for this chapter in particular, A Light Inside, it was really, I think, my first long-term project. I mean, this has become a 10-year, long project, but A Light Inside, this chapter was my first, really staying committed to a community and a place for a, long period of time, which was about 4 years, 2013 to 2017. And for the first few months, I didn't even take pictures. And I didn't even take photographs, and really would just hang out. Obviously, always had my camera with me. I was always very transparent about who I was and what my intentions were, but I didn't just immediately jump in and start, photographing people. I really took my time to try to understand the situation, to become comfortable with the context in the community, and allow people to be comfortable with me. So having conversations with people, talking with people, before really picking up my camera and, starting to photograph people. But Tamara was the first trans woman I really started to photograph in Lima. And then from there, I met, a lot of trans women live in the same buildings together. And so I met her friends and and then it just kind of came from there. But Tamara was someone who I continuously photographed over the 4 years that I worked on this chapter of my long-term project. Again, not shying away from moments like this that show the reality of what Tamara and many women like her face. She was injured by a client who threw a glass at her face because he wanted to have unprotected sex and she did not, so they got into an argument. But then pairing images like that with images like this, this sort of unexpected, right? Unexpected moment that sort of challenges our conceptions around people or places or communities, right? I mean, Tamara she was working, but she took a break and walked to the corner store with her neighbor's little girl, Rosalinda. And then you see the police in the background. So it's like this moment where we don't forget the context of what the story is about, but this very tender, sweet, unexpected moment that really challenges our perceptions of people or what we expect to see. Again, moments like this, right? Just enjoying a meal, hanging out, laughing with friends and family. Again, challenging our our like ideas of what we think a community might look like. But again, not shying away from, you know, another aspect of of Tamara's reality, and many women, you know, in this community's reality, which is that many do use drugs as a way to deal with the very challenging life and cards that, you know, they've been dealt because of transphobia and discrimination. And then again, trying to photograph quiet moments that tell the story, but in a less obvious way. You know, like just focusing on details of people's lives that tell a story about them without necessarily having to see it, right? I mean, Tamara was an extremely faithful person, and these were like her prized possessions, her prayer cards. And anytime she moved, and she moved a lot because of housing instability and discrimination within housing instability, within housing, she would, you know, very carefully pack all of these with her and very carefully, you know, arrange them in her room. So trying to tell a story of someone through these quieter moments as well. But then again, showing images like this that maybe we might expect to see, but when shown with images that tell, again, the full picture, it gives them more balanced and nuanced and accurate portrayal of women in their lives. So Tamara, it was towards the end of knowing each other that, you know, she told me that, well, first of all, she, you know, was like, I want to tell you something, but I don't want you to judge me. And I, you know, her friend who she had introduced me to had just died of AIDS. And it was like one evening, and she was texting me and said, you know, I really want to tell you something, but I'm afraid to. And, you know, I tried to just give her space, you know, and time to tell me by saying like, hey, you don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, but I'm here to listen. If you want to tell me, you know, just kind of giving her space to find the words or the moment that she wanted to tell me. And she did. She told me, you know, I have HIV, and like I would prefer that the el bicho, or like the bug, you know, eat me rather than stay alive. And, you know, when I first met Tamara, she would often tell me like, I don't want to live, you know, I don't want to live past 30. Like, why would I, in a society that treats me less than human? And it actually is a fact that most trans women throughout Latin America die before 35 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think it's gone up to like, no, I'm sorry, the homicide statistic has changed slightly. It used to be that Latin America led the world in trans homicides at 80%, and now it's like almost 80. It's gone down a little bit to like 78. So she told me that she, you know, has HIV, and she decided to seek treatment. But very soon after, you know, getting on HIV treatment, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which is very common. A lot of times, you know, if your immunity system is down, then that allows an opportunity. They're called opportunistic diseases, I think, opportunistic something, to come in and, you know, infect your body. So then she was dealing with HIV and tuberculosis simultaneously. And again, wanting to show, again, the consequences of the fact that trans women are relegated to sex work. Because what I was seeing at the time, especially, a lot has changed in 10 years in terms of what we're seeing in the media when it comes to portraying trans people. But at the time, really the only images we would ever see were of women in the act of doing sex work, whether that was just standing on the corner at night or putting on their makeup or with a client. Not once. I mean, I think I have a couple of pictures where like a trans woman is like talking with a client, but I never like photographed, you know, someone with a client, because to me that wasn't necessarily the story. It was enough to show like representations of that, you know, women on the street, da da da. But I really, again, wanted to focus on the consequences of that. Again, through health as a aspect of the story. And unfortunately, Tamara passed away in 2017. In 2018, 1 month after her 30th birthday. And of course, that was really, really, really difficult for her mother. First of all, this is her mom, who they were very, 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 very close. So it was really, really hard on her mom. But it was also, I mean, it was hard on me too. I mean, I had photographed Tamara probably, you know, on average 3 to 4 times a week for 3 years. And, you know, we had our own relationship, you know, we shared lots of moments of laughter. We really got to know each other. And that was really hard. Yeah, I had seen and heard of women dying in the community, but I guess when you're close to someone, it's kind of like that thing where you think like it's not going to happen to you or someone you love or someone you're close to. And so it was difficult. And, you know, I felt very powerless. And so I knew that I wanted to do something more with these photographs. So thankfully, I was able to create a photo book, but my intention was to make it not for the photo community. I really wanted to create a tool that could be used to educate people within the healthcare sector and within the university school space, to inform people about this issue, that trans women are, you know, not given access to further education, that because of discrimination within the healthcare sector, a lot of women don't seek help until it's too late, which happened in many cases. And so I wanted to create a photo book that would serve that purpose of educating people within these spaces. So I partnered with Leila Huerta, who's pictured here. She's a very prominent trans activist in Peru. And we then collaborated with organizations like Amnesty International and a very prominent university in Peru to give presentations to clinics and hospitals and universities, and then donate the book free of charge. And the highlight of that experience was, so this is Dr. Matos here. He was a doctor who treated Tamara and also Piojo, another woman I photographed, who, if you want to see the full story, you can on my website. And I traveled back to Lima in 2018 to tell him about the book and ask if we could do a presentation in the hospital. It's a public hospital in Lima that's very close to this community I photographed. And, you know, Dr. Matos and I had also developed a relationship over the years, because I would be there in the hospital, you know, photographing Piojo and Tamara. And I was telling him about the book and everything. And then he said, well, you know what, I have some news for you too. We are about to inaugurate the country's first consultation area for trans women. So basically now in Hospital Loaiza, when trans women come to seek care, they don't have to go where all of the other patients go. They can go to a separate consultation area that is led by trans women, where they know that they're going to interact with people who understand, you know, their situation, who know how to correctly use pronouns, who know how to correctly use their name, because the discrimination wouldn't happen only from healthcare workers themselves. And sometimes it's just lack of knowing, lack of education, lack of information, that would then lead to acts of discrimination, again, perhaps like unknowingly. But you know, when you don't inform yourself, that is sometimes what can happen. So, so not only from healthcare workers themselves, but also the patients who would also be there in that space with them. So very big deal, very positive step in you know, helping and supporting trans women get the help that they need and with their own health. And I believe to date it's still the only consultation area for trans women in Peru, which, you know, on a political and you know, is still a very conservative country. I mean, so is the United States politically, especially at this moment, with lots of legislation against trans people. And I was just like, wow. I mean, I was like speechless. I was like, wow, that's so amazing. Like, thank you so much. Like, and it was a bittersweet moment because at that point, Piojo and Tamara had passed away, and this was the hospital where they had received care. So it was a little bittersweet. And he looked at me and he said, no, thank you. Like, had you not been here photographing, I would have never known that this issue existed in my backyard, because again, the hospital is very close to this community. Which of course like feels like kind of weird as a photographer, because you're like, it's not me, like, you know, but that meant a lot. And it really showed me that photography has a lot of power even beyond just the published image, right? It's the relationships that you have with people. It's informing people through the work that you do of certain issues, because yeah, okay, he's a doctor. He probably should have known about this issue, but for whatever reason he didn't. But through my work as a photographer and, you know, with Tamara and Piojo, who were open to me photographing them and following them in their lives, you know, he was able to become informed about this issue and then actually cared to do something about it. So that was really cool to see that. And it's still, you know, I haven't been able to go back to Peru since the pandemic, but you know, every time I go, I visit the hospital, and it's like really cool. You know, like I said, trans women lead the space, and yeah, it's just very cool. And I just really quickly before moving on, David, how are we on time? How much time do I have?
I've got quite a few questions that people want to
Okay.
ask, so that's going to take us about 10 minutes. So if you've got a couple more minutes, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm just going to very quickly, please someone ask me about, this was the first long-term project I did. And so navigating those conflicting feelings of I'm just a photographer was really difficult, but I got through it. So, and kind of touched on in the beginning. So if anyone has a question about that, I'd love to talk about that more, but very quickly, I'm just going to end on Abre Camino, which is the project I'm working on now, or the chapter of this long-term project I'm working on now. And this looks at the push and pull factors compelling trans women in Central America to migrate north towards Mexico and the United States. And very similarly, you know, facing situations, you know, of the women that I photographed in Peru, but with the added layer of violence from gangs in Central America. And again, you know, photographing the lives of, in this project Abre Camino, Alexa, who's photographed here, who's pictured here, as well as Catalea, whose migration journey I followed all the way from San Pedro Sula, Honduras, to the Guatemalan Mexico border in Tapachula, to the northern Mexico-Texas border in Tijuana, and now I still continue to photograph Catalea and Alexa in the United States. I want to stop on this slide because so Catalea, let me go back. Again, it's kind of interesting talking about this work and not necessarily focusing on the stories themselves. But so Catalea fled Honduras because of transphobia from her brother and, you know, the gang members in her community, similar to Alexa. But she finally made it to Tijuana on the Mexico, California border. And she got this number on a tiny, tiny little piece of paper. And that was part of the metering process at the time, where people sort of waited in Mexico to be called to the border to present their asylum case and cross into the United States. Present their case. It's a whole nother thing once you get here. But to seek asylum, to say, I am here to seek asylum in the United States because of XXX issue. So she got this number on a tiny little piece of paper in September of 2019. And she was waiting to be called. It was very like soon that she would be called in around, early 2020, but then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit through Title 42, the Trump administration, and then was continued through the Biden administration, closed the borders indefinitely and did not allow migrants the opportunity to seek asylum at the border. And so Catalea was stuck in Mexico, and all of the issues that she had been dealing with already, unstable housing, really, really, really tough economic situations, just exploded, exacerbated because of the fact that she was now stuck in Mexico and she had to wait there indefinitely, and she had no idea when she would be able to cross into the US. And so she really, even in her own words, she said, overnight, everything went downhill. And I saw a visible difference in Catalea's outlook on life. Catalea is a very strong person, very positive, no matter what situation she finds herself in. She, is a very faithful person, and she, kind of keeps a smile on her face. But this period was very difficult for her and very dark for her. She would often say, like, what, I just feel like I should go back to Honduras. This is so hard. But then in the next breath, she said, but if I go back to Honduras, I'm a dead woman. My brother won't rest until he sees me in a casket. And so she was in a really, really difficult place. And there were moments and times where she didn't want to talk about it. And she didn't, she would withdraw. And, I had to give her that space. Obviously this was a really important part of her story to tell, right? What migrants go through when they're forced to wait in Mexico, or when they're faced with circumstances like this. It was a really important part to try to portray, but she wasn't ready. And I had to respect that and honor that and be okay with it, whether she decided in the end to allow me to photograph her or not. So I gave her that space and that time, and eventually, she was ready for me to photograph her in this part of her story. So again, allowing people space and time, and I allow is a funny word, because it's like, I don't mean like I own the space and the time, but like giving, just stepping back as a photographer a lot of times is also very important. Not taking pictures, listening, waiting, trusting, which is hard, because as photographers, we want to take pictures, we want to portray these issues, but sometimes, a lot of times, it's more important to just put your camera down.
Yeah.
But she was resilient. She crossed the border, and I've continued to photograph Catalea and Alexa in the United States. And again, trying to tell the whole story, quieter moments like this that symbolically show her strength, their strength, this community's strength. These are some selfies. And again, going back to my point of the people that we photograph are people. They are people. They have homes, they have lives, they have families. There are consequences to the work that we do. That's why informed consent is so important. Because sometimes someone might say yes, or you might think that they say yes, and you're like, oh, I gotta return something into the editor, so I'm just gonna photograph them. And then you actually might be doing more harm than good. What if they said yes, but you didn't tell them informed consent, and suddenly their photos like on the front page of the New York Times, and now they're fearing for their life because their location has been disclosed. So you really, really have to treat people and their lives as sacred. and understand that your work can do harm. It can.
Yeah.
Obviously, our intention is to do good, but it can do harm if you are not careful. And sometimes even when we're careful, you know, hopefully we don't make mistakes. But that's why it's important to take the time with people.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not going to go into this, but this was a project that I did with multiple women, looking at migration around the world. And then we partnered with the Pulitzer Center to create curriculum from these stories to give virtual presentation across classrooms through the United States. So this is another aspect of, you know, thinking about how your photography can have impact beyond just the published image. And then thinking about ethics in terms of who you are as a photographer. So in addition to my assignment work, my personal project work, my own life as not a photographer, I am very involved in grassroots photo organizations that are working to try to increase diversity, inclusion, and equity within the visual media industry. And so these are some of the organizations and projects that I have collaborated on, co-founded, am a team member of. So I, you know, also think about how ethics can translate into just bettering the visual media industry and who has the authority to tell stories and what stories we tell as photojournalists.
Yeah.
And that's it. So thank you. I'm ready for your questions.
All right. So we've just got a few minutes, but so I'm going to combine some questions together. And we've got 3 questions actually about informed consent, which connects with like one of the last points you made about how you deal with informed consent to ensure an ethical approach. So a question from Stefan, Ted, and Jim. I'm going to put those together. Can you briefly say what you mean by informed consent? What counts as being informed? And Ted raises the point that it's obviously an honorable objective to have informed consent, but what about in either a fast-moving situation where it's difficult or a situation where someone might want to withhold consent because they might want to be hiding some truth or some crime or some corruption or whatever, not particularly relevant to the particular story you've been showing us through, but one could imagine that as a photojournalist. How would you think about the stress on the idea of informed consent by that demand to actually uncover something?
Okay, I'm going to try to be quick. So again, there aren't necessarily any hard and fast rules in, you know, photojournalism. I'm talking about my practice as a photojournalist and what feels right to me as a photojournalist. So for me, informed consent means as much as humanly possible, stopping and talking to people and saying, hey, I'm just going to use an example. Hey, I'm a photographer. And I often say I'm an independent, you know, photographer. And right now I'm working on a story for X Publication, which is a, you know, newspaper, both in print and online in the United States, but also has audiences all around the world. And we're doing a story about X topic. And, you know, would it be all right if I photograph you and if I ask you a few questions that might appear in the story? I send my pictures to the editor. Sometimes I don't know what they pick, because sometimes people are like, hell yeah, I'll tell you my story, and then might get upset if their story doesn't make it or their picture doesn't make it in the article, right? I mean, a lot of times people have to muster up the courage, or they're, you know, I said I was gonna make this short. Recently, I gave a presentation on Abre Camino, and Catalea called in, and people asked her questions, and someone was like, why did you, like, what made you want to share your story with Danielle? And she was like, I am sick and tired of this, and I want people to know what happens to trans women, right? So sometimes people actually, I mean, a lot of times people actually want to tell their story because they want it to be out there in the world. So you also have to like let people know, like, it may not, you may share all of this time and information with me, and, you know, it may not actually be published, right? So as much as I possibly can, even in fast news situations, of course, if you're like photographing a protest or even the border wall and there's thousands of people, of course you cannot ask consent from every single person, nor are you, I mean, of course, every country is different, but in the United States, if you are in a public space, you don't have to ask people for their consent. You don't have to. But again, I like to, and I think I like to because I just feel better knowing that that person is allowing me to take their picture. And then sometimes, like I said, talking to people leads to other stories. And I also think talking to people makes better pictures, however icky that sounds, because it's not about just making, but better pictures means more accurately portraying their story, right? I can tell when a picture has been taken far away, you know, like talk to people, right? So as much as I possibly can, even in breaking news situations, there have been images that I have photographed in like fast news situations where I'm taking pictures, and then I talk to the person and they're like, no, I don't want you to take my picture. And even though I'm in a public space, I'm like, it, you know, sometimes, like, again, we are also love this because we love photography. We love the beautiful aesthetic aspects of photography, the silhouettes, the light, whatever. There are so many beautiful pictures out there. You miss a moment, you miss a picture, whatever, you'll make more. Right. So even when people say like, no, actually, I don't like that you photographed me, then it's like, okay, no worries. Like, it's, you know, you don't have to worry that picture's not going to show up anywhere. Right. Taking cues, right? Even in news situations, you know, you can tell when people don't want you there. You can tell. So you have to be in tune to everything around you. And if you see people like doing this or whatever, then go somewhere else and photograph, you know, because especially with like migration and sensitive topics, like you don't know what publishing their picture might cause harm for them, right? For people who like are trying to hide something, et cetera, I mean, again, no hard or fast rule, but typically, like if you are a public figure, like a politician or an actor or a county judge, or, you know, if you are already a public figure, in some situations, I have been in a situation where a politician is like, please don't photograph me. And I honored it. I was like, okay. You know, I took a picture where he was kind of off in the background, but he was like, and you know, it's kind of like annoying because you're like, we're in a public space. Like I can photograph you if I want to, like, but I mean, it would have been impossible anyways. He asked me not to photograph him. He would have tried to hide. And then I prevented being that person in the media that, you know, it's also about like, the media is under attack. Like nobody trusts the media anymore. You know, we're labeled as fake news. And I feel like that also comes from the relationships you build with people when you are photographing them. So I honored that. And maybe he was like, wow, I guess not all, you know, like maybe I changed a little bit inside of him of how he portrays the media. Right. So yeah, so that's how I would answer that question.
Right.
But just one last thing. In long-term projects, I continuously have conversations with people, right? If a picture is about to be published on, you know, Instagram or whatever, I try to just continuously check in with people, especially if you are continuing a long-term project in your,
yeah. Super.
Okay.
We're going to have to bring it to an end there. I know that there are a number of questions which I've made copies of that actually, Danielle, I'm going to give you, and
Okay.
we can deal with those directly as well. But we need to let you move to the workshop. And so I just want to thank everyone in the audience for coming. Danielle, you provoked some great questions, great discussion, and thank you very much. So we will have our third public events next week at roughly this time. And now we'll let you get on to the workshop itself. But Danielle, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you too.
Alrighty. Bye.